All right, so we are going to go over the questions that you guys had over Chapter 7 that I got off of your pair decks. There are 10 questions. They're in the document that was attached to this video for today's e-learning day assignment. So we're just going to jump right into the lecture. I'm going to focus on the questions that you guys asked, although the other material is obviously going to be in front of you. So starting with slide 1, in terms of looking at mercantilism. So that was one of the major questions that you guys had, is what is mercantilism? Remember, you have to remember that Great Britain is trying to pay off all of its debt from not only the French and Indian War, but also the larger 7 Years' War. So what it's going to do is it's going to engage in this thing called mercantilism. Now, in Part B there, it says that the British wanted what's called a favorable balance of trade. By the way, when it talks about currency problems in COLS period, that means colonies is all that's an abbreviation for colonies. So what mercantilism is that favorable balance of trade. Now what that means, because I know several of you probably are going to say, well, I don't understand what favorable balance of trade is this. Very simply, the British want, and really every major country wants, more exports than they do imports. Now, when we're talking about more exports than more imports, we're talking about money. We're not talking about quantities of goods. We're talking about we want more money coming in from things that we're selling, those are called exports, than we're having to pay money for things that we are receiving. Those are imports, all right? And the way that they're doing that is they're using the colonies in this way. They are buying, quote unquote, and I put the quotes in there because they're not, in some cases, they're not even buying. They're just outright taking goods from the colonies at little to no actual cost. So they're importing for very, very low cost. They're taking those imported raw materials like lumber, for example, and they're turning them into finished products. So we'll say tables. They're then selling those tables back to the colonists at a much higher than market price, and they're forcing the colonists to purchase from them, the British. So you import, quote unquote, the lumber to make your table for little to no cost, and then you're selling it for a much higher than market price to maximize your profits. Okay, so that's that's sort of your simple explanation of mercantilism, a favorable balance of trade, and then that's sort of an expanded definition of that. Now, the question of why not tax all of them, that's in reference to the Stamp and the Sugar Act. Why tax just sugar? Why tax just stamps? Well, the short answer is that they're not just taxing those two things. They are taxing everything. Sugar, for example, it says there, molasses is something that's going to be taxed under the Sugar Act. When you're talking about the Stamp Act, it's any printed good. So deeds, titles, legal documents, all of these things would have to have a seal or a stamp. So it's not just a postage stamp that we're thinking of. The Stamp Act is actually taxing any type of paper good, printed good. All right. Now, what is worth pointing out as well, and this is going to get down into like these intolerable acts later, these taxes, especially in the case of the Stamp Act, these taxes are actually much worse in Great Britain. Okay, so why don't the citizens of Great Britain fight and rebel? Well, that's because the citizens of Great Britain never enjoyed that salutary neglect. Like what we talked about earlier. So when we talked about salutary neglect, we talked about curfew. You have a 10 p.m. curfew, but your parents never really pay any attention to it. And so when they finally bust you a year after you've been abusing your curfew, you're angry, you're upset. And that's what happened to the colonists. Well, in Britain, they never had that salutary neglect. So this would be like if your brother or sister had a 9 o'clock curfew. Well, why isn't your brother or sister so upset about their curfew being so soon? Well, that's because it was always enforced for them. Okay, that's why a lot of times maybe your older brothers or sisters look at if you're, a younger sibling, they look at what you get away with and they say, well, that's not fair. It's the same kind of thing here, only the British citizens themselves that live in Britain don't have any way of really understanding this because they've always had to pay these taxes. Okay, so representation, it seemed like you guys kind of understood this. The colonist view, the one on the right there, the bold or the all caps down at the bottom, no taxation without representation. That's sort of the big takeaway point. Parliament's view is Parliament represents everybody, not just people in Great Britain. That's called virtual representation. Even if you don't directly elect them, you're still represented. And that's sort of the two sides to the issue, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in class this here probably on Thursday or Friday. The female combatants, this will be the other day, Thursday or Friday. We'll look at this a little bit more in depth. A lot of you tended to have some pretty decent observations about this image. We're going to go into more depth though in class, so I'm going to kind of skip past this pretty quickly. Now we get to some colonial resistance. So, and there are a couple of issues here that you guys brought up in terms of questions. So first of all, is this the event that causes the Boston Tea Party? So we're talking about the Townshend Acts or the Boston Massacre. The questions were a bit unclear. The Boston Tea Party is going to be in response to a lot of things, including the Townshend Acts, including the Boston Massacre. So the short answer is they're part of what caused the Boston Tea Party. These two are not the only reasons. The second thing is, why is tea such a big tax? Like, why is tea such a big deal? Well, we talked about this before. The colonists are British citizens, and so British customs like high tea, that's tea at noon every day, kind of a big deal. Okay, so that's part of it. The other part of it is not just the tax, but it's the fact that the colonists were not allowed to look at any other markets for tea. Okay, so you're locked into, I have to buy from the British. All right. The tax wouldn't be such a big deal if the colonists were allowed to go to sort of the lower bidder. So it's not the tax so much as it is the forcing of the colonists on the part of the British to buy from Britain. Okay, and finally, a lot of you asked questions about the Boston Massacre in terms of casualties, in terms of what's the significance of it. The casualties, there's not that many casualties on the whole. There's something like there's somewhere between 4 and I want to say 8 or 9 victims. It might be as high as 12. But the number of casualties is not as important as this is the first time that any type of resistance has ended in violence. And it's worth pointing out, too, that, yes, British soldiers do shoot into a crowd of colonists, but that word taunting is very important because the colonists, there's reports of colonists who are shouting obscene phrases at these British soldiers. There's reports that the colonists this is in the winter, so the colonists are taking snowballs and throwing snowballs at these soldiers. And because, look, the streets of Boston are not like the streets of Boston today. You have gravel, you have dirt, you have sand. And the legend goes is that one of these snowballs had a bundle of rocks in them, and that when this snowball hit, the soldier thought that he had been shot, and so that's what led to the openings of fire. Crispus Attucks, in terms of knowing that Crispus Attucks is the first victim of the Boston Massacre, that's not necessarily of any import, other than there's a high school here in Indiana called Crispus Attucks High School, so that just gives a little bit of history there. That's another image that we'll look at here later in the week. We're going to take our time and kind of go through some of the imagery. That's just a smaller picture of Crispus Attucks. Now, this image is something that I do want to talk about on the left. It's called the Bloody Massacre. This is an artist's portrayal of the Boston Massacre, and it's worth pointing out that this is a bit of propaganda. Okay, you'll notice that, and it's hard to depict this. Obviously, it's hard to depict somebody, taunting someone in some cases with words, but the colonists here very much look like the victims. It appears as though the British soldiers are in battle lines, that they are being ordered to fire by the officer who is depicted on the far right. This is a bit of propaganda, and propaganda was very common in the colonies. It was also very common in Britain at the outset of hostilities in the American colonies. It's just something that's worth pointing out. And then it's just a picture of a gravestone. So some more resistance that we get into with some more sort of questions here. These committees of correspondence. These are just committees of basically organization. There are some questions here on this slide about Minutemen. Minutemen sort of get their rise out of these committees of correspondence. I'm not really sure where Minutemen came from on this slide in particular. You have Samuel Adams, though, there on the left, who is in charge of organizing these committees. And the Minutemen basically, though, to answer the question, Minutemen were soldiers, and I use the term soldiers loosely because you have to when you're talking about the colonists. They're soldiers who are ready at a minute's notice, and that's why they're called Minutemen. They're not, I say that I use the term soldiers loosely because they're not trained soldiers. They are farmers, okay? They're businessmen. They just happen to be ready at a minute's notice, okay? The Intolerable Acts, what are they? It says it right there. It's a bundle of acts including the closing of Boston Harbor. This is where you get troop quartering. So now colonists are being made to offer quarter or housing to troops. And then there's also as a part of this, there's this thing called the Quebec Act. We can talk about that, though, a little bit more in class later in the week. Now, we then get to the actual Boston Tea Party itself and the revolution beginning. So, guerrilla tactics, it made its way onto slide 8. I'm not sure how I don't know why it's labeled slide 8, because it's not on the same slide as the Intolerable Acts. But guerrilla tactics, this is sort of non-traditional tactics. So you wouldn't come out in clear battle lines, and then draw aim and fire. Okay, you're going to hide in the woods. You're going to hide in some cases, homes, and you're going to surprise patrolling soldiers, British soldiers. Those are guerrilla tactics. And that's sort of, and this is where you get your Minutemen. Those are the troops that are going to end up firing the first shots at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. This is just Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. This is sort of the troop movements and the revolution beginning. So to sum up the last two questions, which side did Germany and France take? The easy answer for France is going to eventually side with the colonists, although they're going to take their own sweet time, and we'll talk about why a little bit later. Germany, however, as a country, didn't really have a side. However, their mercenaries, and that's that last question, their mercenaries are going to be hired by the British, and that's what a mercenary is. A mercenary is simply a soldier for hire. And so where we will leave off is next week we will begin talking about the actual fighting of the revolution. We're going to have to move kind of quickly, though, so you're going to kind of have to hold on for the ride. But make sure you get that document done. When you do get it done, just simply turn it in. That way I can see that you watched this video. 15 minutes in and out, and then we'll be ready for class on Thursday. So hope you guys have a good e-learning day, and I'll see you on Thursday.